I'm used to being the funniest guy on a panel in the academic world, so I'm guessing that's not going to happen today. Just to give you some background to myself, I'm Steve Robertson. I work as a Professor of Men, Gender and Health at Leeds Beckett University in the Centre for Men's Health there. And it's an honour and a pleasure to be here talking about something as important as men's mental health and well-being. To introduce the panel members, David Baddiel, I think most people will know, became famous originally with the Mary Whitehouse Experience, a radio series which moved to television. He's since appeared in many comedy shows on radio and television, including the 2004 to 2007 Radio 4 show, Heroism, which challenged a lot of received opinions. So I'm hoping we're going to be able to court some of that controversy on the panel today. Then we've got Jake Mills. Jake did the course in Liverpool Comedies Trust Funny Business course and was competition winner of that in 2008. He was a finalist in the Leicester Mercury Comedian of the Year award, and he's performed regularly in many of the country's biggest comedy store clubs. We've then got Matt Haig. Matt's primarily a writer, and he's writing covers a broad spectrum of stuff, including novels, screenplays, journal articles, and his work's been translated into 29 languages, which is pretty impressive. He's written, this first novel was called The Last Family in England, and that was a UK bestseller, and he's also won the ALA Alex Award in America and the TV Book Club Summer Read Award in the UK. And then finally, my good friend and colleague I've known for a number of years now, Jane Powell. Jane's a lifelong campaigner and set up the campaign against living miserably, initially back in 2000, but then more so from 2006 onwards. She successfully developed the Calm's distinctive brand, including into a website and a hugely popular magazine, and I'm sure she'll tell you a bit about the more recent work that she's done, including the current Links campaign. So over to you guys. The format now is that each of the panellists is going to talk individually for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then they're going to talk amongst themselves, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So over to you. I guess we'll go in order if that suits everyone.
Yeah, I didn't realise that we were going to speak individually, but so I haven't got a prepared bit
Good.
About depression, sadly. One thing might be worth saying is I used to be a patron of Calm, Jane's charity, and she'll have heard me tell this story before. But what happened was I was at my first day at taking my daughter to primary school, and Jane came up to me in the playground and said, "Would you want to be the patron of my charity?" And I thought, well, I'm going to have to see this woman every day for the next 7 years. So if I say no, I'm going to feel so fucking guilty. I just have to say yes. Even though that was the reason, I'm glad I did, because I had suffered and still do suffer from, but not as badly, from clinical depression. But I dealt with it in a very, I spoke about this if anyone was at the last session, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. I dealt with it in a very straightforward way, in so much as you can deal with it, which was to go into therapy and take antidepressants and all the rest of it. But through Calm, I met all these young men who didn't have any template for dealing with depression, who came from a very different background, and who essentially didn't really know what was happening to them when they became depressed. And that is really, I think, one of the things we need to talk about, is this idea of men not being able to speak about their emotions, so therefore they get depressed. Men is not a block. There are many, many different types of men, and a lot of it will be to do with your background and to do with your understanding and to do with, just whether or not you're given the tools to deal with depression, and not all men are, and that isn't just to do with their gender. That's my bit.
Fantastic. Thanks, David.
I must say, my introduction was crap compared to everyone else, wasn't it? It's all right. Matt's got a book in 112 different languages, and I done a comedy course 7 years ago. I'm here. I'm not here as like an expert or an academic. I have got a degree, but it's in media, so I don't think that counts. And I got the degree at Liverpool Hope University, so it definitely doesn't count. For anyone who doesn't know Hope University, it's called Hope for a reason. That's the only qualification you need to get in, and it's the only thing that you leave without.
Are you doing?
I'm
your
doing my
set?
set.
You're doing your set, aren't you? Yeah. It's going well.
That's what the email said. I'm here basically because I wasn't very good at suicide. I had depression for, hard to say, about 7 months, possibly longer, possibly shorter. Listen to the tension now. Anyway, can you feel that? And after keeping depression to myself, after not telling anyone about it, and just telling people I'll look after it myself, and genuinely believing that I would get through it myself without anyone's help, I tried to commit suicide. And it's a really weird thing for me to say and a real weird thing to hear, and I understand that because I didn't ever think I'd be someone who went through depression. Certainly didn't think I'd be anyone who tried to commit suicide, but I did. Long story short, my kind of recovery, if you will, has been quite well documented in kind of national media, on television and in the papers. And one thing that's really happened since speaking so publicly about what I went through was how many people were coming to me, not necessarily to say, oh, well done for speaking out, but people who were saying, I didn't know anyone else felt the way that you've described. I feel like that, and I thought I was the only one. And I realised that there's thousands and thousands of people going through exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, all feeling like they're the only ones. And every interview that I did, I would get messages from strangers, people, wives asking for help and advice for their husbands, and mums asking for help and advice for sons. And it made me realise that we need to be doing a lot more. So kind of after speaking out, I've realised that I want to be helping to make that change and working with Calm and working with other people to try and get people to talk, to try and normalise mental health, to try and put a face and a voice to mental health. And basically that's what I've decided to dedicate my time to. I understand it's a lot of time and a lot of work, but that's basically my story in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jake.
I'm a writer, but my reason I'm here is when I was 24, like Jake and David, I became ill with depression, and but going back to that word template, I didn't have a template at 24. It was just felt like a total breaking down of everything I'd ever sort of known, and I was very, very ill for, I suppose, 3 years. And we have these labels like depression, anxiety, but mine sort of blurred as they do into other areas. So I was agoraphobic for years. I nearly took my own life. I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand, there was no obvious cause for it, and I didn't even know it was depression at first. I just felt this sort of very alien experience and very sort of trapped in my own skin. Everything was very, very familiar and then suddenly different. I lost friends because, not because they weren't sympathetic, but just because I cut myself off from them. And I was difficult boyfriend. Obviously, it's not very easy always being there for someone who's very ill. And part of my recovery, I think, there's all sorts of reasons why I got relatively better. I'm not cured. I still get depressed. I still have anxiety and all kinds of things. But I'm nowhere near where I was. And I think part of that was just coming to terms with it. I used to get depressed about having depression. I used to get anxious about having anxiety, and I don't let that sort of cultural stigma, scariness sort of get in my head in the same way it used to, and I've sort of come to terms with that. And I think, part of that with me was certainly that I didn't think it fit with being male or being a man, or I felt it was some sort of judgment on me as a personality, and it took me years to sort of get over that. And, writing, I wouldn't write now if I hadn't had that experience. I wrote a book called Reasons to Stay Alive, which was quite therapeutic, just the act of writing about it, because I was being able to sort of communicate stuff I hadn't been able to communicate at the time. And I think we need to do more talking about it. I think one of the reasons why therapy is as effective as medication is because that simple act of externalizing and talking and writing about stuff actually is a kind of medicine in itself. So things like this are good, I think.
Thanks, Matt.
Where to start? When I set Calm Up as a charity in 2006, when I said suicide's the leading killer of men under the age of 35, really the media didn't believe me. They just kind of thought I'd got my numbers wrong. And it took a long time for them to really clock that actually I was correct, the numbers were right. We did some research into how many people were aware that suicide was such a big killer. And around 1 in 10 of the population back in around 2008, 2009, knew that suicide was that big a killer. Suicide accounts for around 76, currently 77, 78% of all deaths in the UK. It's the single biggest cause of death for men under the age of 45. And awareness of that is currently around 20%, so we've gone up 10%. So it's a massive killer. So it's more common than road deaths. And yet there is so little awareness. And the question which kind of kept coming back to me was, why couldn't I get any money? Why couldn't I get any coverage? Why wasn't it a national story? Why was it never on the telly? Why was it never, ever covered? And it took me a long while to kind of really understand why that was. And I think there's 4 key things I'd like to talk about really briefly. One is suicide. We don't want to think about suicide. We don't much want to talk about suicide, because really suicide, as far as society is concerned, is somebody who takes their life is somebody who is failing in some way, someone who's kind of morally bankrupt, somebody who doesn't really deserve to live or have the ability to live. You make a very moral judgment about that issue. We also have a very fixed notion of being a man. And that is somebody who's in control and who is, looking after everybody else, somebody who we look up to, somebody who sorts everything out for, somebody who pays all the bills, or at least makes sure they pay all the bills, and somebody who is fireproof and in control. And if you're not that, then by definition you're not a man. And so here we have the collision of 2 things. One, suicide, a guy feeling suicidal and in need. And by definition, if he's in need, then he's not a real man. And so the response from society is to grow a pair, to man up, literally. No one says to a woman when she's down, be a proper woman. There is no criticism there. The reason that the media and news and the politicians don't really take suicide seriously is because this is just about inadequate men. And I think that's where we have to push back and say that this is completely unacceptable. But it's also where we have to look at ourselves and look at culture and look at the messages that culture gives and that men receive about how they can and should be. Because I think there's 2 other myths. One myth is that men aren't very good at emotions and they're not very good at talking about stuff. A couple of minutes in any library, I think, should disabuse you of that notion, or listening to music. I think there's probably quite a few songs out there which are quite good. And the second thing is that men won't seek help. Every time we expand our helpline, we get more calls. So 4,000 odd calls so far and rising. I think that if we had 10 times the amount of money, we'd take 10 times the amount of calls. If we had 100 times the amount of money, we'd take 100 more calls. The thing is, men will talk, will listen, but the issue is that there isn't that awareness around them because we don't want to talk about it. And they don't feel they can talk because society says if they do so, and to do so is for them to be seen as inadequate. So who wants to do that? And I think that this is something that we can't ignore. We've one suicide. One suicide causes enormous, long-lasting damage on everyone around that person. We know that those people around that person are more likely to take their lives, suffer breakdowns, financial loss, joblessness, ill health. This is a national issue, and it's about time it was on the national agenda, and we took it seriously. It's a public health issue. We have to act, and at the moment, the only thing that we've got is a kind of sitting back in the chair saying, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Men just go out and get drunk. They won't go and see their GP, so what can be done? And I think that's totally unacceptable, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jane. It's interesting for me because almost all of you have spoken about sort of dominant male scripts and the role that they may or may not play in both depression, seeking help or not for depression, and in suicide. And I guess one of the things that I'd like to ask you all is what do you think of the notions that masculinity is changing? Men are becoming softer, more able to be open, in David's words from earlier, more touchy-feely. That's getting more common and more allowed. So I guess two questions really. One, do you think that's actually happening? And if so, do you think we will then see a shift in terms of men's ability to open up and talk about depression, and therefore a related reduction in male suicide?
Is that to me? No.
It's to all of you. It's to all of you.
I think that things are changing, yeah. And I think that men find it, and young men find it really hard to live up to the notions that are put in front of them, and that's why I think the magazine does so well. But I think that we're not responding to that as a society. The same messages that keep coming down. Be a man. Nobody says to a young boy, when you grow up, you're going to stay at home and look after the kids or go out and get a job.
I think there is a persistence in culture of an idea of a real man. It's often not taken very seriously anymore. It's kind of a slightly ironic idea. Even James Bond is now a slightly ironic James Bond that harks back in order to be James Bond to previous incarnations of himself. I think to be that tree trunk man doesn't really properly exist anymore. Despite that, in terms of what Jane's saying, I think there exists still a kind of yearning towards it. And the truth about what she's saying is that men and women fail in exactly the same way. They lose their jobs, they screw up their marriages, they don't go on with their children, whatever it might be. But only men translate that failure as a failure to live up to an ideal of their gender. And that suggests that something does persist. Because that failure to live up to an ideal of the gender implies that the ideal of the gender somehow still exists, even though the idea of the real man is a comedy idea. Yeah. So I'm saying that both exist. This degraded, comic, slightly absurd idea of the real man, and a real thing that is making men feel like failures.
Yeah, but there's also other new comedy ideas now about men. Even this festival, even talking about masculinity in any way. You get people talking about man tears and mansplaining, and all of this is a sort of new sort of forbidden area, which is the same forbidden area in New Clothes, where men still can't talk. It used to be just the sort of caveman idea that men don't need to talk, man of few words, strong, silent type man. And now, there's a kind of landmine. If you spend as much time on Twitter and places like that, which I do, which isn't great for your mental health,
no.
but we've just got new stuff blocking talk, and I think there is progress being made, but the suicide rates indicate it's not being done fast enough. There's still a massive gap. I think one of the reasons I took loads of alcohol and drugs when I was younger, not realising, I think, that I probably had low level of depression and stuff. And I think it would have been a bit easier for someone like me if it had been a slightly more open environment to talk as a young man about vulnerabilities and issues. But I didn't have any space to do that. So
I think there's some progression, but I think everyone would agree there's a long way to go. But if you look at even things like the like with the feminism movement and the with the LGBT movement, things such as them two perfect examples can help men understand what it's meant to be as a man now, that it's different, that what this ideology that we have of being a man, this caveman idea that we struggle with, and let's get it right, men 40 years ago, 50 years ago probably struggled with that as well. The feelings that we're feeling, the thoughts in our head aren't new for our generation, but hopefully we can start encouraging people to do that. But similar to what Matt was saying, I went through really quite bad depression and, as I said, a suicide attempt. And I went through that at exactly the same time that one of my best friends was going through it. And I didn't tell him and he didn't tell me. And it was only until afterwards when I was talking about it that he went, oh yeah, I've gone through that as well. And so there definitely absolutely is a massive barrier that's not allowing men to talk to men in the sense of what, as we've said, is looking weak. But I do think we are making movements, but there is a long way to go.
When I was talking in the previous session, one of the things I talked about was how, as a comedian, I had always done comedy which was about my own crapness, if you like. Being a confessional comedian involves saying often, to simplify it in a crude way, I was a rubbish boyfriend, I was rubbish in bed, I was rubbish at this, blah, blah, blah. And so what is interesting to me about I don't know if you weren't a comedian at that stage, but about you saying you couldn't talk about it, is that I always felt it was the same instinct that led me to be a comedian and to sort of share all my flaws on stage and try and get people to laugh at me, and therefore, in a way, to absolve me and to, make them feel that was all right, as made me go into therapy when I got depressed.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely had that to a certain extent, where it was kind of like, look at me, I'm an idiot, but I didn't touch the things that were actually affecting me.
Right.
And I had a one-man show, and I said, well, I'm going to do this about going through depression and what I'm feeling at the moment, and I just wasn't ready to do that.
Right.
It was until I came to write it, I was like, I can't touch it. So I do things about, don't I look funny, don't I act funny, but it wasn't real, the issues that were at heart, really.
Okay.
So are there sort of places or spaces, do you think, that do allow and facilitate men to open up? If we're saying that one of the problems, one of the issues, is that men have these emotions and feelings, always have had, as you said, Jake, but seem to be unable to articulate them, are there places and spaces where men can and do articulate? And can we utilise those in terms of what you were asking about, Jane, in terms of solutions?
I think part of the solution lies with each other. We've had Women's Hour over the last 30, 40 years, and it's been brilliant for women. It's been brilliant for women my age, and it's changed everything. It's changed everything about how we can be, where we can go, what we can do, what work we can do. It's changed our self-image, and it's given us, on a daily basis, the words that we can find to use to identify what's happening in our lives, to be able to express the things that hurt us, and to also give us the confidence to go, well, this isn't right. and it's been fantastic. And it's had a huge change, and we can see that suicide in women from 1981 to 2012 to 14 has dropped year on year by about 40%. Isn't that amazing? So clearly there's, we can act on that issue, and I think that part of what we have to do as men and women is to question some of the notions that we have about how men should be. I was about a year ago. I was in a conversation. My husband was there, and his best friend was there, and there were all the shelves there. And I just put up, 20 yards of bleeding IKEA shelving. And his best friend said, "Well, why did you let her do that? Why didn't you do that?" And you just think, well, why should he? Where do we get these completely stupid ideas? Why should he be good at DIY? He's rubbish at it. Why do we have these notions still that men are good at hitting things really hard, carrying out the rubbish, doing the DIY, changing the plugs?
I've got some jobs at my house that need doing, Jane, if you want to pop round.
I charge.
Yeah, I know.
So
Well, actually, I wanted to pick up on the Women's Hour thing a little bit. I'm not sure that Women's Hour in itself has brought down the rate of women's suicide, but when I listen to it. But nonetheless, there have been attempts to do a Men's Hour. Radio 5 did one. And it sort of comes back to what Matt was saying, because, it was an all right show, but it sort of wasn't taken seriously. Yeah. Because the idea of men having a space where they could talk about men's stuff has got a slightly comedy thing to it, and people thought it had an ironic voice, that show, which Woman's Hour doesn't have. Now, I think you can ask the question as well, like, Woman's Hour, is that okay? Because Woman's Hour implies that 51% of the population just have an hour to themselves in 24 hours of broadcasting. That in itself is maybe problematic, but I think insofar as, there's a problem anyway with men being considered, I touched on this on my last session, men are sort of considered the norm still in our society, the sort of default gender, and therefore women are more allowed to talk about what's happening to them because it's not considered, oh, well, we all know about that. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of like we all know about men, so we don't have to talk about them. And that's completely wrong. Yeah. But at the same time, it is a problem because when you do start to talk about men in things like that Men's Hour thing, it very quickly becomes something that people ironise or make jokes about or don't quite take seriously.
Because there is this real embarrassment that men should have a kind of woman's hour. There is a real embarrassment that men can be needy. And I think that and I think that we need to hold that up and go, well, that's bizarre. Why not? We have this real implicit judgment about men who are needy as being it's wrong. It's kind of it can't happen.
I think men, the concept of masculinity is so strong, but also so fragile. Men feel, or marketers certainly feel that men feel so fragile that about being a man that they need to have man-sized tissues, or everything needs to be sort of masculinized and machoized because we've got to be always in that space of being a man. Like I write books, I can remember an editor warning me off having a female central character in a kid's book. I ignored her, but she warns me off from doing that because she said, oh, boys won't read that because they won't read about a female central figure, which is obviously bad for girls, but it's also bad for boys because we've just created this fenced off little space of what being male is, and that we can't cross over that fence in a way that girls can cross over the fence. But that's partly because women through the centuries have been seen as the sort of other second sex, and that being the man's the important thing. But it's bad for both sides of it, I think.
Well, and similarly, still, there are no real female superheroes. The heroic is an important idea in this, because when you're talking about this strange, degraded notion of what being a man is, it comes with an idea of heroism. And I think, personally, that the suicide thing is to do with that. I think that men who are lost and feel lost as men see in suicide a kind of nobility, a kind of misplaced nobility. And I said this slightly contentious thing in an article I wrote recently, and I'm not sure it's true or not, but I think it might be, that I think even men who go and join ISIS are partly doing that because they see a kind of heroism, I mean obviously incredibly misplaced, and nobility in it, and of course a way of committing suicide along that narrative. And I think that is linked to the fact that there is this weird notion that persists that men should be heroes, and it is true. You can't get any money behind a female superhero. In the Avengers Assemble, there's one of them, and I don't even really know what her power is. And so instead what you get is this weird thing where the most successful superheroes now are like Batman, Spider-Man, and Iron Man, who are still men, but they're all flawed and uncertain about their heroism, which is sort of where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in like films like Lethal Weapon, you used to get suicide sort of would come up as a theme, but where it comes up in the most ridiculously sort of macho way of like Russian roulette or something right extremely masculine and tough.
Yeah.
So, speaking as a woman,
Yes.
no, there are quite a lot of more and more action-dominant female characters that you get. So the recent Hunger Games.
Yeah, Hunger Games, that's true.
And I think more and more we get that. But I think the thing about the way that feminism has changed is that it's really, and why suicide in women has gone down, is that the range in which we can be and express ourselves is everything, is 100%. We can be weak or we can be strong. We can find it very hard to carry bricks or do anything, or we can be a lumberjack, or we can be a prime minister. We can do damn well what we choose to be, and nobody's going to see be a proper woman for that. So the space in which we can occupy has totally changed. And when I look across at guys, I kind of think, actually, the space in which you occupy and your freedom of expression is really limited and incredibly fixed. So it is down to being aggressive, being able to hit things really hard, and do the heavy stuff and pay the bills. And as soon as you move outside of those areas, there is a question about your sexuality. So he's wearing pink, he's wearing a silk shirt, something weird there. And I think that's, you know, seeing the huge changes there's been for me as I've grown up has been brilliant. And I see that the changes, so women are able to, and it's acceptable to be a strong woman or a weak woman. It doesn't really matter, it's still a woman. And I think when I look across at guys, I just think it doesn't feel like that for them, as far as I can see.
So do you think perhaps that some of this ties into sort of economic shifts? The fact that we're now much more service industry based, which has been said to be more amenable to women working in service industries rather than manufacturing industry based, which was a very common route for men. So does that raise questions about men's loss of identity?
I certainly think there's an enormous factor that you have to look into, like I said earlier, with not looking at men just as a block. So I think, I think it would be harder to deal with depression if you found yourself in a place where a manufacturing industry used to rule the place and that was what you did and you had your role there and suddenly that wasn't there anymore. Yeah, definitely. And I think all those factors need to be played in. I mean, just one thing I would say, Jane, about women, there are huge rates of self-harm and anorexia amongst young women, and I think, as you know, there's like lots and lots of issues that women face that they just don't transmute into suicide as much, or indeed into quite the same failure to live up to an ideal of womanhood. But I think there are lots and lots and lots of issues that society places on young women that also causes them mental health issues.
And they do translate into suicide attempts, which are actually higher in women than they are in men.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It is. We see that, I think, and that again is really interesting. We have to kind of get down to gender. So we can see that women will try cut their wrists, take pills, and then call someone. And there is no shame in calling someone because women are supposed to be weak. So that's okay. And I think for a guy to fail suicide is the ultimate shameful act. You know, you are so incompetent that you can't even do that right. And I think that men feel a real need, if they're going to do it properly. Do it so that there is no turning back. Try it so that the means that you're going to try it are irrefutable, and you're not going to be able to step back from that. So you're going to step in front of a train, you're going to hang yourself. And I think that
there's less of a cry for help, isn't there? Because the cry for help is communication. And so with men, you know, they're beyond communication at that point anyway, so they don't try to cry for help, they just do it. Sort of.
Well, we see that 42% of guys, according to our latest stats, have thought about taking their lives. Out of those, I think it's been at 41% actually asked for or talked to anybody about it. So less than half. And I think they don't feel that they should or are able to talk about it.
So I just want to, how much longer have we got?
I think we'll open it up.
Because we should,
any minute.
I feel people want to speak. I didn't want to do your job for you.
No,
so sorry.
Good. We were there.
You were there, yeah. Well, you showed me you noted. So does anyone
let's open it up.
Of course, now no one may want to speak. Oh, no, there's someone there.
Lots. We'll take the one nearer the front and then the guy near the column.
Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
You'll have to forgive me because this is a thought that I've literally just had, so I've not articulated it before. But one thing that sort of struck me is that all of you have spoken about, and it's really well documented, that one of the constraints on men being able to talk is this comparison between the gender stereotype and the masculine macho man, and them not feeling able to live up to that, or that it then constrains their ability to talk because that doesn't fit in with that stereotype. But something that sort of struck me just today, which I just wondered if you've ever explored or thought about, was a similar parallel between the gender stereotype of comedy and masculinity, and that, you know, I think the panel is quite representative, but also just in the comedy world and more generally, it's a male represented. I can't say that word. I don't know why. Area, and actually, if you go back to sort of primary socialisation, one of the things that we do is that boys are funny and girls don't need to be funny. And if you ask blokes, you know, about their ideal woman, I mean, this is very sort of generally speaking, they wouldn't necessarily describe a funny woman immediately, whereas most women would want a funny man. And actually, in a lot of ways, you know, I think implicitly, David, you touched on it, but that notion that men make light of things, that in itself limits their ability to talk. And maybe that's why Men's Hour was such a failure, because you've got a group of men who make light of things, and actually women don't feel the need to make light of things. We can just talk about things seriously.
Okay.
And is that something that's ever been thought about or explored?
Well, there's two different things you're saying there, actually. One is about comedy and gender stereotype, and obviously they're closely related, but I would say I very much, as someone who's with a very funny woman, I wouldn't be able to be in a relationship with a woman who wasn't funny. Is absolutely top of my list of what I would hope to be with someone, and I absolutely think it is the most nonsensical, useless discussion about whether men or women are funnier. People are funny or not funny. But I do agree, however, that men are more likely to sort of funnel serious stuff when they're not comfortable talking about serious stuff into kind of banter. And it might be the case that is a problem. At the same time, weirdly, and this doesn't quite make sense, but I am very much of the opinion, certainly with the type of comedy I'm doing now, that you can really, really use comedy to talk about serious stuff. That actually the most interesting comedy is dealing with the most serious subjects in life. I know those two things don't quite hold together, but I do believe that is true.
I absolutely agree with that point. I think comedy is such an important tool to be able to get people together in one room and for you to hear about a subject. And if you can make light of something, suddenly your defence is down a little bit about it, and you can talk about it a little bit more. And I think comedy should be used for everything, because it is a fantastic tool to get people talking. Because you can say a joke on stage, and then that joke will be passed on a building site or wherever you want, and it gets people talking, and it gets people thinking about, especially a really serious subject such as suicide and depression. It gets people thinking about it from a different point of view, in a different way, and especially when you're talking about feelings and things that we all feel and we all go through. If you can use comedy to share that and to say, yeah, other people do think this, and then everyone's laughing because they're saying, yeah, I do that, I think that as well. You're opening that up to say you're not the only one.
I think in a way, it's a really interesting point that you're making, which is, me and Jake do think that, I think very deeply, that comedy is a way of dealing with this stuff. At the same time, you sort of have to look at the individual way in which people are doing it, because you're right, there is another way of doing it, which is to sort of use laughter to dismiss, like say, oh, I'm not bothered about whatever problems I've got, I'm just going to joke about them. That is true, that can be done. But I think there's just another way of doing it, which is to actually open it up by using laughter to try and address it and deal with it in a way that is really useful, I think.
There's always also been interesting research done on how comedy can be used to maintain certain sort of social hierarchies and things. So I think David and Jake are right. It can be used in incredibly positive ways, but it can also be used to replicate certain current oppressive hierarchies as well. I don't know if you had anything to add, Matt.
Yeah, well, with the book Reasons to Stay Alive, I deliberately tried to make it funny. I'm not naturally that funny. I'm slightly more funny than my wife, but that's not a gender thing. That's just a sort of way it worked out. Right. No, she's funnier than me, actually. Yeah, I think something like depression needs humour. And I think depression itself, anyone who's gone through depression knows that depression really wants to be taken seriously. So it's quite medicinal to not and subvert it and stick your fingers up at it and sort of be the jester in your own head. But it's funny and serious aren't opposite things. Done right, are they?
No.
Yeah, let's this guy near the column.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your chat earlier on. 2 years ago, my good friend Stan, he was a bit more successful than you, Jake. He took his life, and I found out afterwards that he was very, very depressed, and I never really noticed this. I noticed that he was down. Now at the moment, I realize that my brother is also suffering from depression, and I just find it very difficult to open that conversation and just to start talking about like the feelings. And my brother's very stubborn. He doesn't really want to have any help at the moment, whereas I think obviously he does. So I was wondering how to best deal with with a situation like this, and to like open up that conversation, because it's difficult being a man to another man, and especially because like it's gone wrong in the past. So I was wondering if you have any tips and tricks, and like see.
It's just health. You know, we have this sort of divide between mental health and physical health, and I think, you know, if he had any other kind of illness, you know, just imagine that and how you would deal with him in that illness. And I think, you know, depression loses some of its power when we start talking about it like any other health complaint, and it helps you personally. You know, if you're in bed and you know it's because of flu, knowing it's because of flu kind of helps you. If you didn't know what flu was and you were suddenly in bed, not able to pick up a £10 note, and you're sweating and stuff and you didn't know what it was, it's worse than knowing it's flu. And I think so long as we know depression is a health condition, it's something that most people live with, recover from to a degree, and you know, a lot of suicides are preventable, then, you know, it's just about not stigmatizing it around it and just being taught. And there's no right or wrong words. There's just right or wrong approaches, I suppose, or perspectives.
I wanted to, I mean, in terms of actually practically, though, some of the young men that I met when I was working with you in Calm, it was clear to me, and these are people who had tried to commit suicide and essentially been saved by Calm, that I thought one of the amazing things, having met them at that stage, is I don't know how you made this journey, because they really did seem to be like young men who wouldn't naturally be prepared to open up about this stuff. So in terms of answering that guy's question, how do you do that?
Okay, so two things there. One is, so how do you talk to your mate who is feeling suicidal? I think is really, my advice is to ask him and talk to him. To ask him and say, and to try and ask open questions. Rather than go, you're not going to do anything stupid, mate, are you? Which is a closing down question. Is to ask him and say, you seem really down. What's happening? Tell me, you seem really depressed. I'm worried about you. Talk to me. And to ask him and allow him to talk. I think, and to not be afraid to use the S word. You know, are you feeling suicidal? How long has this been happening? As if he's ill, because he is. And allow him to say that, and if he is ill, then not argue that he's not. So I think one of the things that we see is that the person that we think of as being suicidal is some miserable guy in a bedroom locked away, and actually my typical suicide would be young, outgoing, energetic, everyone's friends, and I think it's really important to just have those conversations and to and not argue. So not go, but you've got everything going for you, because that isn't how he feels. So I think have that conversation. I think the other thing about how do we at Calm mislead guys into using the phone line and go down that is to use comedy, to use art, and most of all is to say this is really common. You are not weird. I think that every guy can go through feeling suicidal. And so the question, and I think that's in one way immensely reassuring. We can all hit that point. So the question is, when we hit that point, what can you do? And I think if a guy, and also to explain some of the symptoms. So some of the symptoms of a guy being depressed and suicidal isn't sitting there with a bucket of ice cream on the phone crying, but is probably being quite irritated, probably sleeping a lot or not sleeping at all, probably drinking quite a lot, being quite exuberant. And so I think that creating magazines and creating materials and merchandise and a website which doesn't look like this is for people with mental illness, and actually using and creating an environment which feels normal and healthy and okay, enables guys to kind of go, yeah, me too, so what can I do? And the helpline that we do is free, anonymous and confidential. It doesn't show up on phone bills, doesn't cost, and that gives guys a space to talk without feeling that they're going to let themselves down in front of their mates, their colleagues, their family, their workplace. And because until we get to a point in society where those judgments are made around men, I think we're going to need to have that kind of service.
Can I just jump in on that one? Sorry as well. What I would say as well is for you to do is to find out what help is available. Find out not only Calm, Samaritans and mine, but find out, if there's any places near where you live, find all the help that's available. So when you are going to them, and absolutely I agree with both Jane and Matt in that everyone in the world has mental health. Everyone has mental health, and sometimes it can go up and down. So normalise it when you are talking to them. But you make sure you know where the help is. So when you are talking to them and you are normalising it, even if you're talking about yourself and you're saying, yeah, I've been there, I've felt shit before. So you normalise it, but have the help available, because sometimes just knowing help is available and never using it. Sometimes just knowing it's available is absolutely crucial. So that's what I'd say to you as well, is see what's available out there and have a look.
I think the other thing that we know from sort of project after project is that men often need time, what they call shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face to start with. So it's about just spending time with that person in settings and places they feel available and creating that opportunity for conversation. And then, at an appropriate point, introducing the conversation. But time spent shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face can be incredibly useful. I think we have, and I don't know where to go. I know that guy's had his hand up for ages, but we've got hundreds of questions now. I'm afraid we're going to have to go over here because I think this person had their hand up the longest.
Hello. There's a foundation near me where I'm from called the Eaton Foundation, which solely deal with male mental health issues. Is that a good way to go? Should we encourage more centres where it is solely just about male mental health and not mental health as a whole?
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea. Really, really good to see that. We should have one everywhere.
Yeah, I think in utopia probably not, because we've all got the same issues. But yeah, I think for now where we're at in society, probably is a good practical thing.
I think again we know from research that certain male-only things work well, like the men's sheds movement. We've done some work recently looking at weight loss initiatives and comparing mixed weight loss initiatives to male-only, and they're very different. So I think at certain times men do need that place and space.
Well, one thing I would possibly add, just to sort of mix it up a little bit, is I think that when men want to talk to someone, it's very good that all this stuff that's being said, that they learn that they're not the only one, and that there are lots of other men with these issues, but they don't necessarily just have to talk to men. It's quite useful, I think, for men who are depressed to talk to women. You see, I think it's really helpful. My therapist, when I went to therapy, was initially a man, and then I changed it, not because of the gender, but I found that there were certain issues I had that were better expressed talking to a woman, and that was still obviously a man talking about his mental health, but it was really useful talking to a woman. So it doesn't have to be a kind of a closed gender conversation, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can squeeze one more in. We'll go to this young woman. And I guess we will have to wrap up.
Thank you all for sharing your experiences. And I had a question which sort of relates to what you were saying just now about also women's role. And I really wanted to know what you think women can do to sort of try and open these kind of communication channels, especially women, myself included, who have had mental health problems, and how we can sort of use our experiences and our more sort of sort of ability to be open to help our fathers, our brothers, and our friends.
I'd say just make talking about health, mental health, problems, issues, worries, just make that normal. Just make talking, whether it's with your father, whether it's with your boyfriend or your husband or anyone, just make being open as normal as possible. Talk about your own problems, but also, ask the questions and really totally play it down and make it normal. But because the last thing I know, when I was going through it, people were coming to me and it felt really intense when it was like, something's wrong with you, what do we need to do to help you? And that just pushed me away. And now I'm talking about it, now everyone knows about the problems that I went through and still go through. Talking about it's a lot more open now, because I don't have to hide behind it. So I would kind of just recommend just talk and make it as normal as possible, so then, and not just when there's a problem. Talk about how you're feeling when things are good, so then when it is a problem, when someone's not feeling themselves and not feeling great, that they don't have to worry about a barrier. They can come to you because they know that that's what you do.
I think possibly one other thing might be worth saying is I think men are often quite frightened of the judgment of women. And when they feel that they've failed as men at some level, even if unconscious, it's an idea that there's that they've failed in front of women. Some sort of not necessarily a specific woman, but there's something there that they feel that's how they offset their failure as a gender. So if you're talking about how could women help directly, it would be to say, in a way, okay, talk to me and I will not be judging you as a man. You know, I'm not. It's got to be a kind of. I mean, the whole conversation about mental health has to be entirely non-judgmental. But I think men can project onto women that they are being judged, and so it needs to be clear that they're not, I guess.
Yeah, I'm incredibly lucky that I was in a relationship when I became ill, and I'm only alive now because of Andrea, my partner. And it wasn't because she had any special training. She didn't really know much about depression. No one in her family had been open about depression before. It was just simply having that lack of judgment, like David said, and just totally being there. I mean, she did sort of prompt me to do certain things, write down what I was feeling, go running, stuff like that. But it was more just the having someone there, you know, by your side, not necessarily to talk directly about depression all day long, but just to give you the space to be ill sometimes, the space to be able to talk about it, to work out what to do together.
Actually, Matt said something there that probably seems very simple, but the running thing, one of the things about being depressed, which if you haven't had proper clinical depression, is you actually feel pressed down. You actually feel a huge weight on your body. And so the last thing you want to do is move. But if you can force yourself through that and go running, I mean, I hate running anyway, but if you can force yourself through it, it really helps. Yeah. It's sort of remarkable.
With anxiety as well.
Anxiety, yeah, as well.
Because I used to get these terrible panic attacks, and if you think of the symptoms of a panic attack, it's very much like the symptoms of running.
Flight, yeah.
So you can't have a panic attack when you're running, when you're sort of 10 miles into a run. So I just had this idea, I'd just keep running forever, and not very good for your knees, and it didn't work out. But I mean, yeah, running. I need to still run every sort of 2 days. That's my...
It is, though. It's the fight or flight response causes anxiety.
Totally.
So if you're fighting depression badly, you think, I'll take the flight option, and then you just run, and it helps.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I've had a panic attack by running, by the way.
I think finishing on that Forrest Gump note is not a bad place to finish. So thank you all for your time, and thank you to the panellists.